When you view an infotext, webinar, or movie, you do so with 4 caveats. First, you are agreeing to the terms posted at the webpage listed on this slide. Second, our lawyers want you to know that what infotext presents is often time-dated or about new trends, regulations, or guidance, and therefore we cannot provide this material with any warranty whatsoever. Thirdly, material provided with infotext webinars and movies is copyrighted. You keep the copyright to material customized to your organization, but infotext reserves the right to use the material in other engagements and boilerplates. See our Transfer of Copyright Agreement at the webpage listed in the slide. Finally, those who view our webinars or movies may be added to an email mailing list. If you do not wish to receive notice of additional educational opportunities, please accept our apologies and please opt out at the webpage shown on the slide.
Hello everyone and welcome to another Infotext movie. Today I will be talking about assurance reviews and our Control Centric approach to them. Or more specifically, how to review a SOC 1 or SOC 2 with Copilot. My name is Adam Reynolds, and I've been with Infotext for about 12 years now, and vendor management is one thing I review as part of IT audits. It's something I review internally as my compliance officer role, and it's something I speak to at conferences and events on occasion. But I thank everyone for being here today, and again, as we and a lot of other companies start trying to find ways to capitalize on artificial intelligence, one of the first things we did was make a business case for using Copilot to review SOC 2s, because it could save us a good amount of time. But let me pull back a little first, because this is all under the umbrella of vendor management. Specifically, one of the 5 core tenets or precepts of vendor management, as we call them. We have many movies covering these 5 items and vendor management as a whole, of course, but today I'll be focusing on assurance, that being the review of a SOC 2 report. So this movie is really for anyone interested in wanting to know how to use a Copilot to review a SOC 2, or at least our process as we have it so far. We have not formally implemented this process yet. We're running it side by side in some of our reviews to test it. But again, we don't have a formal process in place yet. We're still developing that. So if you're interested in this movie, you probably have some understanding of vendor management, whether you're a vendor owner, an information security officer, the vendor management coordinator. But we're going to go into the details of the whys. Really why we're doing this, what does it accomplish, how does it fit into your vendor management, but most of that really just at a high level, because really we'll be talking about using Copilot primarily for SOC 2 reviews and what SOC 2 reviews, or the goal of reviewing those is. But we do have a few prerequisites before moving on to the SOC review. You should have a general understanding of vendor management and how the SOC review process fits into it. And then the inherent risk of a vendor should be known before reviewing a SOC. That inherent risk rating kind of sets the stage for how much scrutiny, or also really how much a missing control might impact overall security. But the vendor should have a risk ranking already done, such as critical, high, moderate, low, and it does look different at different institutions. But in general, we really are going to be focusing on the critical and high risk items or vendors here. But the main point of a SOC review is to read between the lines. Know what controls should be expected, to see in the report if those controls are actually declared and tested, and if there is a difference, investigate and document it. Because the purpose of a SOC 2 review is to review the assurance and see if it actually meets our standards and our risk tolerance. Something that the reviewer, most likely won't be deciding, but the reviewer should be documenting any issues or deficiencies as we will get into shortly. So before we get into the SOC review process, the vendor owner, if it's not yourself, will be getting the SOC report from the vendor, will have described the vendor, and may perform other duties as necessary based on your vendor management program. So, of course, there is some advanced work before we even start the review process. Again, we need the SOC from the vendor. We need to know what services the vendor performs, its description, and then the inherent risk ranking. The inherent risk ranking comes from a number of different criteria, as seen in our boilerplate for vendor threshold analysis here. The biggest factors are if the vendor will host customer information or other sensitive information, or will have access to it. Following that, of course, how much does your internal operations rely on them for critical services, as well as things such as how much the engagement costs, which of course presents a financial risk. But this should typically be done by the information security officer before being given the SOC 2 or the SOC report to review. And then let me mention the kind of SOC reports. First, for each, the SOC 1 through 3, it can be a Type 1 or Type 2. Type 1 being the report that covers as of a certain date, versus Type 2, which is over a particular amount of time. Typically, this would cover 6 to 12 months, and you may see bridge letters that cover additional dates as well. But SOC 1s are really focused on ICFR, or internal controls over financial reporting. Of course, important for financial institutions, but really not what we're looking for today. It's the SOC 2 we want to be reviewing, as it focuses on security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy. And then the SOC 3, which does focus on items, as in the SOC 2, but SOC 3s are made to be public. So while the information is still good to have, it's the SOC 2 that's going to get us the details of what we need. And then, of course, there will be a number of sections in the SOC report. I'll bring up an example in a couple of slides, but in general, they follow this format. They'll, of course, have a cover page and a table of contents outlining what's in the report. Section 1 will be the auditor's report, which would include things such as the date of testing, the auditor's credential, and of course their signature. Section 2, which goes over the service organization's assertion. Section 3, the service organization's description, which usually includes user control considerations. Section 4, the tests and results, usually in a table format. And then Section 5, or really the vast majority of the report, additional information provided by service organizations. But before we dive into an example report, there's two things I just want to mention. First, no two SOC reports really ever look the same. They'll have the same general information, but a lot of it does not look the same from one report to the other, even with the same independent service auditor. So there is most definitely variation between SOC reports, and that's something you'll only see as you go through more of them and kind of understand as you run through more and more reports. So let's dive into an example report. This is Expedient's SOC 2 report from last year. We have been given permission to review their report using Copilot and to share it as part of our movie. They are a critical service provider for us as they host a number of our primary and backup systems. But as you can see in this report, we start off with a cover page, really describing what this document is. We then, of course, have the table of contents. This document is actually 124 pages. The length of these SOC 2 reports is really one of the primary drivers of why we want to use AI to enhance our process. It takes a long time to review these documents, and if we can have help, we're going to try. And in this report, there are only 4 sections, with the final section taking up the majority of the report. But the first section is the Independent Service Auditor's report. A second section, assertion of expedient management. The third section, their description of their services. And then fourth, really the controls and their testing. So let's kind of just jump along into that fourth section, because this is really the majority of what we're going to be trying to evaluate and understand. Of course, everything else in the document is also pertinent for us to know. But again, it's really these specific controls that we want to be reviewing as part of our Control Centric Approach to reviewing SOC reports. So on page 46, and again, the rest of this document really is devoted to these controls, but they have a statement, or they say they have a particular control in place. They then have a column for the service auditor's tests to document and show what the auditors tested for this control, and then if there were any exceptions noted to the results of this test. If the control was working as expected, there would not be any exceptions. If there were, then of course we would see that here. But as we start moving on to the expected controls, we will have our own list of what we expect to see in here. And we hope that the controls as described by the organization and then the service auditor's tests shows the controls we expect to see are in place. But SOC reports aren't perfect. Just because a vendor has a SOC report does not mean they are secure, because again, the report can show exceptions to controls the vendor has in place, showing they're not working as intended. And it may not cover all the expected controls, meaning controls we would expect to see aren't even in place to be tested. So a SOC in itself is not a sign of security. It goes back to us to review and understand the report and what deficiencies there could be. And there are things, not always, but again, a SOC 2 report, which is the one we want to be looking at, really focuses on confidentiality. That is one of our prime risks. But sometimes they don't cover everything else well. What we've seen in the past, and this is of course on a case-by-case basis, but that some SOC reports don't necessarily cover business continuity well, or go into the specifics of application security testing or penetration testing. And then of course they don't include hot topics or areas of interest that examiners might be looking for. Such things such as incident response plans, or address incident response in general, or include newer topics, which I know is something we should all be discussing with our vendors these days, which is artificial intelligence. But really, boiling it down, your job when it comes to reviewing SOCs is to know what is expected, what is not there, and then when we know what is missing, we can start to risk rank it and understand the risk it presents. Just because there's a deficiency, though, it may not be that bad of an issue, but you need to ask questions to understand it. What is the likelihood that the deficiency will cause problems? It may be small, it may be large. What does the deficiency say about the organization? If it's a control you would really expect from a company that is just completely missing it, it kind of begs the question, what else are they missing? If there's any responses to the deficiencies, how did they fix it? Are they planning to fix it, or have they already? And then provided information to keep us updated on that. But we need to be asking questions, and we need to be documenting the answers to understand the risk so that we can pass it along to those who need it. But like I said before, reviewing a SOC is a fairly straightforward process. There is some advanced work going into getting and understanding the SOC report. There's the actual review, and then really following up with any findings. So let's break up that actual review process just a little bit more. As mentioned, going into the review, we need to have the vendor description. We also need the expected controls. And then finally, we want to review the work to confirm the results. This last step is really important, especially when starting to use Copilot, because as we all know, AI is not perfect. So it's important for a person to circle back around and confirm or verify the results. And let's get back to the expected controls. And when we talk about expected controls, these are really a list of controls based on guidance and what we've seen over the last 20 years in vendor management at financial institutions. So in every SOC report, we expect to see these controls in place. And of course, as mentioned, depending on the vendor's criticality, deficiencies may or may not be as risky. But understanding these SOC reports, going through them, really gives us the ability to read between the lines. If a control is expected and it's not there, we need to understand why. We want to understand and ask questions that help us understand the why. And really, the reason we're here talking about this today is that we believe we can use Copilot to really help us understand the report and improve our processes. So speaking of processes, let's really get into the process. And we've already came up with this much, showing that there's advanced work needed, that we need things such as the vendor description, obviously the expected controls list, the report itself. We can use those to review the report, see what Copilot comes up with, confirm those results, and then of course follow up with any issues that we define in the report itself. But if we want this to be good, we want to design it properly and make sure we're documenting our process so we can review it, for things such as completion, accuracy, and repeatability, which, I'll mention this a little bit later as well, but repeatability can be hard with Copilot. So let's build out this process a little bit more though. As you can see, it starts to get lengthy, but it's really the 2 steps here, review, control environment, and confirmation that we're going to be using Copilot for. But a SOC 2 review process is, much more involved than just those 2 steps I just mentioned. But those are the 2 we're going to be talking about today. So we'll be getting into that shortly, but I do feel I would be remiss if I didn't mention that using Copilot with sensitive information may cause issues. So we always recommend to follow your own legal risk mitigation practices, and make sure that it is okay to use sensitive information in Copilot before you do this. So this is a basic outline of our process for designing this process. Of course, we first started out by analyzing really what we wanted to accomplish and how we can do that. See if it's feasible. We went over the list of expected controls earlier and mentioned they were in an AI-friendly format. Originally, those items are just from a spreadsheet that listed the controls we expected. A person went down the list searching for them in their report. But to use them with Copilot, we turned each one into a question and then ran those in Copilot against the report, trying it. With the results, we confirmed those again against previously done reviews, seeing how its output differed from the manual process. Again, as we have not replaced our manual process yet, we're running it alongside the manual review process. This really helps us understand and gain confidence, if it's showing similar results. And then we continue with steps 4 and 5, repeating the process and tuning it to get, make sure we're getting the results we expect. And then to further define step 1, and again, defining our process is something we want to do throughout it. So again, we document what we're doing and help get repeatable results. But always start off with analyzing the existing process and seeing where AI or Copilot can fit in. If the process is a large and complex one, subdivide it into sub-processes. It's these sub-processes that will be easier to accomplish with AI to start with. And then we can see where we can develop use cases and really start optimizing our process with AI. And the next step is trying it. Obviously focusing on what processes would be best to implement with AI. Break larger processes into smaller sub-processes. If it's something you can compare to a manual process, do that so you can compare new results with old ones. And then continue with your normal processes and see if you can identify where AI can help. But following trying it is to confirm to learn. Learn as you review the results. Again, compare results from manual processes. See where errors happen or if there are issues that would even preclude the use of AI in certain sub-processes. And then take your existing manual checklists and make them into AI-friendly questions and try those. And repeat this using a new conversation in Copilot. Starting a new conversation helps remove past inputs and focus on what your new prompt is trying to accomplish. And finally, to reinforce this again, compare it to manual processes to ensure it's working the same way as the old way. And then repeat it. And again, and again. It can be hard to get a repeatable process in Copilot, and that's why this is important. Continue to build out your sub-processes and repeat them. Each iteration, you should be learning a little bit. It should be improving the process. And this may blend in with the previous step a bit, but really refining the process. Tuning and pruning. Continue repeating the process in new conversations, carefully pruning and tuning the prompt. Confirmation will begin to take less time. After a little bit, you will be spot checking the results instead of reviewing the whole thing. But make sure to back up your prompt and document it as you improve it. And then again, start new conversations in Copilot to refresh it. Using the same chat can confuse Copilot. So finally, what does our process look like right now? Let's take a look at our documents. There are 5 documents in this folder. In our deliverables, there will only be 3. The first 2 items, the ones with zeros, are the SOC report we will be using, and an example output of the vendor description prompt. Again, the deliverables will not have these 2 documents. I'll mention this later, but I made the vendor description for this movie. It is more than likely missing something. And the SOC 2 report is a confidential document. And while we have permission for this video, we do not provide their SOC reports ourselves. Item 1 is the vendor description prompt, which I'll be talking about next. Item 2 is the controls review prompt, which forms the starting point, the initial prompt we will copy into Copilot. I did try to put the instructions for Copilot into a file and throw that right into Copilot, so you wouldn't have to copy and paste anything. Just put a document in there, upload it, and have it do its thing. But couldn't find a way. I'm sure that is possible, but that's something I'll have to follow up with later. And then last, the list of expected controls, which I brought up earlier. So as mentioned as a prerequisite, we need the vendor description, its inherent risk rating, and of course the SOC report. We have the SOC report, so let's form the vendor description and risk assessment. So this is the vendor asset description risk document. I wanted to walk you through our process for this quickly, but this is based on our vendor management program. The idea is we have a number of questions we answer below, and then copy and paste this into Copilot to get our vendor description and risk ranking. Risk ranking would be performed by the Information Security Officer, but again, this is an example and we need this information to proceed. We start off by giving basic instructions here in the middle of what I'm showing to review the information provided and rate it based on certain criteria. Based on the following 11 questions and answers for a vendor at a financial institution and their answers, rate the inherent availability risk and confidentiality risk of the vendor to the institution. We also want the output in a Word document. Then, assume the following. This is from our vendor management program. It forms the basis of our ranking, such as the classification scale and what criteria define our different level of vendors, such as critical vendors being ones that host or have access to confidential information. After giving it that type of information, we have a number of questions that we answer, really to provide the input for Copilot, defining who the vendor is, the costs, what services they provide. Once we answer those, we can copy and paste everything from here to the bottom and input that into Copilot. But let me note that I provided this description again. I am not the asset owner or information security officer. This is for example purposes, and there could be things I'm missing in this description of the answers. So I copied that and put it into Copilot. This will give us the vendor description ranking as an output. And remember, we asked it to provide a Word document with the results as well. And this will be one of the 3 documents we will need for the SOC review, the others being the SOC report itself and then the expected controls, both of which we showed earlier. So then with these 3 documents, let's move into the overall Copilot prompt for the review itself. So this is our Copilot prompt for SOC reviews. It starts off by framing the situation for Copilot, defining the inputs and expected tasks, which are to determine control applicability based on the vendor description, assess control alignment, the main purpose really to review the SOC 2 report and assess whether the controls are implemented and described in a way that meets the intent of the expected controls, assessing each item as either met, partially met, or not met. And then after reviewing the SOC report for controls, document the findings and finally provide recommendations, if applicable, for those partially met or not met. So we're going to copy and paste this whole thing into Copilot. So let's walk through this, having the prerequisites in place and the prompt copied. Now, this is a walkthrough of my most recent conversation with Copilot. This will not be in real time, as Copilot does take some time to think and provide output, but I copied and pasted this into Copilot as stated. It then asked me for the additional documents to upload. Again, the SOC 2 report, the vendor description, and the expected controls. It then provided a bit more detail into what it would be providing as output. Asks how it would like that output formatted. In a table format, I responded. And it provided the download. And it's a little funny because I completely overlooked the document download there. I continued on. It provided an example of how it would output the information. I asked it to provide a full detailed table. It continued to do that. It actually provided usable output here, but of course I wanted that in a Word document. So I asked it to download it. But the document only contained 6 items, which is definitely incorrect. I asked it to provide the full table results, and it continued to provide only 6. And then again, and it only provided 6 more. And actually, while I've been doing this, it's provided outputs that were completely blank, outputs that were completely incorrect, and it's just a great example of why we're just going to have to continue trying and doing this many times and really, again, compare outputs during manual processes, because AI makes mistakes, and comparing this to other processes, what we expect to see, of course, while we develop this, and then really using it on information and seeing what the output looks like in the real world would be the next step of this. But AI makes mistakes, and we have to learn as we go. So this is what our output looks like. We haven't formatted it much, just to make it readable and sortable. But as you can see, we have items met, not met that are not relevant, partially met with notes and follow-up instructions. And let's go ahead and sort this by what's not met. Oops, we can get there. And that's good that it's only not available or not relevant items. But of course, that's only if this is correct, which is why we would want a manual review of this to compare it to. But this gives us a starting point for a documented process that we still need to further refine if we want to proceed with using Copilot for this process. But this is our Control Centric Review process for SOC 2 reports in Copilot. Again, all of these are the controls. And again, we need to review and understand these results, as gaps may present more risk than the gap itself, if you know what I mean. Kind of what else could be there that we're missing. But this is an overview of our process. Again, the prompts and documents we are using now, the ones we will continue to refine as we use this process more and more. And I think we're all in a learning stage when it comes to how we can use AI to enhance our processes. But this is a fairly straightforward approach to reviewing a document against a set of expected items to be in that document. So here are the 3 documents we will be providing. The vendor description and risk prompt. Again, your information security officer will be providing the inherent availability and security risk. The controls review prompt, which is what we use to initiate the review in Copilot. And then the expected controls list, the list of the controls we expect to be in our report. As always, though, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But thank you again for your time. I hope you learned something, and have a great rest of your day.